In the name of God, this is session 12 of your discourse analysis lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about reference and the subtypes of reference and the relationship between, discourse representation and the reference. As I told you, there are some principles which we should obey those principles to have a kind of successful, conversation. First of all, our expression should be true, and the second, as a speaker, we should know that the hearer can identify the reference of our expression. If the hearer cannot identify the reference, maybe there is a kind of mismatch between the speaker and the hearer. But because of many parameters, like for example general knowledge or same experience, same cultural or social beliefs, in the same society, the person can understand each other. In this session, I want to talk about some referring expression. There are circumstances in which an indefinite expression is unlikely to be taken as a referring expression. So maybe the indefinite expression have a kind of reference. For example, my father was a stonemason. You see here, it's a kind of indefinite expression which may have a kind of reference. So we can, as a hearer, we can identify the reference of the indefinite expression. So one of the circumstances in which indefinite noun phrases are not used as referring expression is when they appear as the complement of the verb to be. So this is the one one of the circumstances which we may we may not can understand or recognize the reference of the indefinite noun phrases. So the other condition is when they appear in linguistic contexts which are referentially opaque. Okay, we call it referentially opaque. Like, for example, Marian is looking for a robber. You see here, this is a kind of indefinite expression which we cannot recognize the reference of this indefinite expression. Or Virginia wants a new job. You see here, it's again is a kind of indefinite expression which we cannot identify the reference of this kind of indefinite expression. So we would suggest that in the analysis of naturally occurring discourse, the analysis will have clear contextual or co-textual cues to guide his assignment of referential or non-referential use to these indefinite expression. So he may also use, for example, phonological or paralinguistic clues. So there should be a kind of clues or signs to guide the hearer to recognize the reference of any expression. So there should be a kind of clues to guide the hearer to identify the reference. The use of, for example, the use of proper names like Plato as a referring expression is generally a less controversial issue. When we use a kind of proper name, for example, Plato, or some familiar or famous person, when we call it, we use a kind of proper name. It is a kind of condition which we know that our hearer can recognize the reference of this proper name. Okay, we should pay attention to specific context, non-referential function, role related aspect. So this is the one kind of condition which we can identify the reference, the proper names. The most generally discussed type of referring expression is the definite noun phrase. When we use a kind of definite noun phrase, for example, like the priest, okay, you see, you know that the hearer can identify again the reference of the expression because you use a kind of definite article there. You see, some definite noun phrases may be used non-referentially. For example, we can use some definite noun phrases as, non-referentially. The gun crazy double killer being stuck in a forest may be forcing a hostage to feed and hide him. You see here, this is a kind of, definite noun phrase, but maybe it's not, it is a kind of non-referential expression. Sometimes we succeed in referring by using a definite noun phrase which contains a description that has a specific relation to the intended individual referent. The hearer's knowledge of this specific relation is assumed. For example, the ham sandwich is sitting at table 20. You see here, this is a kind of description which guide us to check the reference of the expression. Or the chicken pecked the ground, or the chicken with bean sauce was delicious. You see here, when we see this kind of definition, pecked the ground, so we can understand this kind of chicken is a kind of a live chicken. But when we see with sauce, bean sauce was delicious, it's not a live chicken, it's a kind of food. So the description can help us to understand the reference of the expression. So, or some kind of pragmatic knowledge can help us to understand the meaning of this or the reference of this, the expression. So sometimes the description can help us to understand the reference of the expression. So first, as I told you, proper names, second, definite noun phrases, and third, the description can help us to understand the reference of the expressions. So in this part, I want to talk about the pronouns, okay, in discourse. From a formal point of view, pronouns are the paradigm examples to expressions used to by speakers to refer to given entities. As you know, every pronoun should come back or refer back to some entity. So pronouns themselves may do not have a kind of meaning. They should come back to another expression to show their meaning. Because of their lack of content, they have become the crucial test case item for any theory of reference. Many linguists believe that they are not actually referring expression but can only be used co-referentially. The relationship between the full nominal expression and the pronominal expression is then described as antecedent anaphor relation. So we call this kind of relation between the reference and the pronoun, we call it antecedent anaphor relation. For example, a large dog approaches A and B. A says to B, I hope it's friendly. You see here, this kind of pronoun, it refers back to what? To a large dog. You see here? So this is a kind of antecedent anaphor relation. The pronoun, this pronoun, itself has the kind of meaning. So for understanding its meaning, it should back to the kind of antecedent, and it should have a kind of reference. This is the relationship between pronoun and antecedent. The use of it in this example, it, you see here, is described as an example of pragmatically controlled anaphor. In this sense, anaphora covers any expression which the speaker uses in referring on the basis of which the hearer will be able to pick out the intended referent given certain contextual and co-textual condition. So it is the relationship between pronoun and antecedent. Pronouns and antecedent nominals. Look at this example. For example, I've just had my hair curled and it looks windblown all the time. You see here, this pronoun it refers back to kind of antecedent nominal, my hair. Again, my hair looks windblown all the time. Normally, pronominal referring back to its antecedent nominal, or pronominal substituting for the antecedent. This general view has been characterized as the pronominal surrogate hypothesis. Okay, they demonstrate that this kind of, I mean, linguists demonstrate that it is not the case that the nature of the antecedent completely determine the interpretation of the pronoun. Like the cooking apple, you remember that example, cooking apples, as I told you, I mean, the apple changed through the I mean, discourse. So we argue that if a change of a state I mean, predicate is attached to a nominal expression, then subsequent pronominal must be interpreted in terms of that predicate. For example, again, after this example, we can say, my hair, which I have just had curled, look wind blown all the time. You see here, it means that I mean, reference and substitution is not a, I mean, simple term, because the noun, I mean, changed during the discourse progressing. So this is not a kind of simple reference and simple substituting. Okay, so this is a kind of substitution, as I told you. Another term, pronoun and antecedent predicate. In this part, I talk about pronouns and antecedent nominal, and in this part, I want to talk about pronouns and antecedent predicate. There is evidence that the speaker's use of pronouns is indeed influenced by the predicates attached to antecedent nominal. For example, look at the example. There is two different ladies go up to the whist, and both have a wig, and they are most natural. You see here, we use a kind of pronoun here. Even this kind of pronoun maybe have a kind of reference, really, but the predicate help us to, recognize the reference of this pronoun. Okay, so they, two different ladies go up to the whist, and both have a wig, and they are most natural. They refer back to the wig, but this is a kind of, singular reference, but this they is plural. But if we look at the explanation and the predicate, we see that, there are two ladies. So we conclude that there are two wigs. So they refers back to those two wigs, which are natural. You see here? So the predicate here help us to recognize the reference. So these examples present a grammatical mismatch. You see here, as I told you, there is a kind of grammatical mismatch. This is, singular, but this is plural in terms of number agreement between antecedent nominal and subsequent pronoun. Our example like this show mismatch in terms of gender. You see another example. There is a car going up the road, and he comes to a crossroad. You see here, this pronoun he refers back to car, but car is, is not a person, so we cannot say he or she here. We should say, for example, it. So you see here, this there is a kind of mismatch in gender. So but we can understand from the predicate and from the explanation that each car has a driver. So this he refers back to that driver, okay, to that person. So the predicate here help us to identify the reference of the pronoun. The other, relationship is the pronouns and new predicate. Maybe we can introduce a new predicate. There are situations where a pronoun occur in a discourse with no antecedent nominal at all. It may be of interest to consider such example in terms of the given or new structure information. For example, I used to go about with a chap. I don't know whether he's still alive now or not, but there was 9, 10, 11 in the family together. 2 girls and 9 boys, and she lost 8 sons one after the other. So you see here, this she, we introduce a kind of new predicate. What is the reference of this she pronoun? You see here, we don't use any name here. So what is the reference of this she? because of the explanation here, we can, identify this she refers back to the mother of these, children. So this refers back to the mother. So here we introduce a kind of new predicate, okay? Or in these examples, pronouns are used to realize given information should serve as an address directing to the listener. So this kind of expression address the listener to identify the new information. So one of our main, or look at these examples, for example, one of our main jobs in the botanics is writing on the flora of Turkey. You see here, this they, again, a kind of new information here. Or I was on the bus, and he, again, here is a kind of new information which refers back to the bus driver. So there is on each occasion more than one potential reference for the pronoun. Maybe in some text, there is one potential, more than one potential reference for the pronoun. Persons like Sanford and Garrett claim that pronouns can never be used to identify implied entities in the extended domain of reference. Clearly, they can like these examples. For example, I have a cousin who is very deaf and she can't hear Jessie because Jessie speaks too loudly. You see, she shouts at her. You see here many kind of pronouns. Maybe, they're competing antecedent, okay? So we call it competing antecedent because maybe we cannot understand the reference correctly here. So what is the reference of she, what is the reference of he? There is here there is we have Jessie, or we have cousin, or you see here. So there are some competing antecedent for being the reference of these pronouns. Or the hearer can choose the reference on the basis of the roles, for example, filled by two participants in the situation. For example, oh, I was on the bus and he didn't stop at the right stop. Again, you see here, this is this comes back by the basis on the basis of the role, okay, filled by two participants. This comes back to the driver of the bus, as I told you. So we have many different kinds of reference for pronouns. So here at last I have a kind of summary of these information. Interpreting pronominal reference in discourse. We have suggested in this section that the hearer base his interpretation of the reference of a pronoun in discourse on his knowledge of the elements listed below. For example, based on antecedent nominal expression, as I told you, and or an antecedent predicate expression, again, as I told you, and or an implicit antecedent predicate, again, as I told you, and or the role of antecedent nominal expression, as I told you, like this one, the driver, and the last one, and or the new predicates attached to the pronoun, the new predicate. These are the summary of the antecedent of the pronoun. We can identify based on the nominal expression, predicate expression, implicit antecedent, the role of antecedent, and new predicate. So in this session, I talk about again the reference and the relationship between reference and discourse, representation. First, I talk about referring expression, as I told you. Then I talk about the proper names, the definite noun phrases, the descriptions. Then I talk about the pronouns and their reference. So the pronouns may have a kind of reference, like antecedent nominal, like predicate, like new predicate, like competing predicate, antecedent, and like based on the roles. So at last I told you the summary of that, kind of antecedent. As I told you, the pronoun may have a kind of nominal expression as its antecedent, predicate expression, implicit antecedent based on the role, and we may introduce new predicate for being the antecedent of the pronoun. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.